Welcome to a special edition of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains, and today we're going to talk about the Western Hollywood capital, and we are talking about Apacheland. For those of you who aren't familiar with Apacheland and the days gone by, we're going to talk now with Hank Sheffer, who has written 2 books on the subject. Hank.
Well, today we're going to talk about Apacheland. And Apacheland was truly a magical place. It came about almost because of pure destiny. There were a lot of stars that have been coming out here for years. They were staying in Scottsdale at the Valley Ho Hotel. And there were some people down here in Apache Junction, which really wasn't officially Apache Junction. It was just a crossroads at that time. And what they were talking about, the fellow who came up with the idea was Billy Creighton, William W. Creighton. And he was the visionary that said, well, they're bringing these people in anyway. Why don't we have a place here that we can bring them here? We need a hotel. We need a filming area. We need a filming town. We need a movie ranch. And he came up with that idea. And so he bandied it around with a bunch of people, and they got the corporation together, which was Superstition Enterprises, Inc., Superstition Mountain Enterprises, Inc., and they sold stocks and all that good stuff, and they started building the town. It started in April. Officially, it was March when they had the groundbreaking, but they started building in April, and they built the main street. Originally, they had thought very seriously about making this like a Disney World or a Disneyland. And it turns out that the fellow who was one of the designers was Nate Weinkauf, who was from Disney. He was one of the Disney people, and he came out, he was one of the builders, designers, and whatnot. So they put this town in, and now it was ready to film.
Hank, just exactly what is it that drew people to Apacheland?
And what was going on was there were a lot of celebrities that were being booked to come in because of their marquee value. Now, marquee value was, okay, we have Peter Brown coming in from The Lawman, and people would just jump up and down, and they come out to see him. And of course, now they're in town, they would see everything that was there. And of course, Bill Creighton and some of his cronies were making a point of going to Hollywood, and they were out there grooming as many of the producers as they could to get them to come out and use Apacheland for some of their filming. There was a lot of filming done out here in Arizona, and the area was just so perfect for it because it was the Wild West. It still really was the Wild West as far as what you'd see on film.
And wasn't Hangtown there before Apacheland?
And Hangtown was just a short street in the very eastern end of Main Street. And what was interesting about that was that it had been there even before William Creighton came up with the idea of building this full set.
Tell me about the sound stage that was there.
The sound stage was the largest sound stage in the state of Arizona. It was huge. Did I mention it was the only sound stage in the state of Arizona at the time? And for those of you who later saw the movie Charro with Elvis Presley, and he's in the sheriff's office and have visited Apacheland, and you saw the sheriff's office, you didn't see the sheriff's office that Elvis went into, because Ron Nix built that sheriff's office inside the soundstage. It was as simple as that. So the Apacheland had some really neat things going for it. You could film at Hangtown. You could film at the main street, or you could film in the soundstage, and all 3 could be going at one time. And now we have why they wanted to call it the Western movie film mecca of the world.
Hank, tell me, what was your favorite film that was shot there?
One of the movies that was done out here that I always really liked a lot was Audie Murphy's movies when he did Arizona Raiders. And that had a bevy of stars, or people who became stars, major stars. Ben Cooper was in that film. Michael Dante was in that film. I want to say her name, Gloria.
Oh, wait, you're talking about Gloria Talbot.
Yes, Gloria Talbot was in that. Gloria Talbot was also involved in that movie. But it was done at the barn that you can see right here at the museum. The majority of it filmed out the back. And what was really interesting at that time is in that film you can see there was no chapel. And the chapel was right near the barn when Elvis came to town some years later, and that was also moved up to the museum here after the last fire.
What was the magic? What was Apacheland famous for?
Apacheland really was famous for some seriously great movies. Not necessarily because of acting or anything like that, but because of what they were. When Elvis came to town and did Charro, that was a biggie. It was a biggie for everybody who loved Elvis, and it was a biggie for Elvis because he didn't have to sing. It wasn't a popcorn movie. He loved playing cowboy, and he got to do that in spades out with Charro. One of the most famous scenes, of course, is when James Seeking, and they have this cannon they've stolen, and they shoot the tower off the top of the chapel, which is now here at the museum. And they blew that to bits, and they were going to blow the town out if they couldn't get the boy back. Well, Elvis won out, everybody was good, and Elvis rode off into the sunset, which is a really neat sidebar because he rode directly east past the barn with his girl, and they left town, and down the road they went. I later did a film out there for Discovery Channel, and I got to ride off into the sunset directly east. Yes, it was early in the morning, but it sure looked like it was in the evening, and I got to ride off into the sunset just like all the other heroes did, for that one glimmer of hope of being a hero.
Tell us about the January festival that is held to celebrate Apacheland.
Every January here at the museum we have Heritage Days. It was originally called Apacheland Days, but then it changed to Heritage Days, which is okay. There's a tremendous following for Apacheland here in the area. We meet a lot of wonderful people there every year.
You know, I thought Apacheland would probably be over and done with after the first fire.
Burned to the ground. And people were afraid that was going to be the end of it, because the only two buildings that survived were the barn and the chapel. That's all that was left. The unfortunate part was that there was still film on a slate that was due to be done that very next August.
What was the series that was coming in that they had to hurry up and fix Apacheland for?
And the thing that was happening was that they had a major series coming in that they had to film again. They'd filmed before, but they needed to film again, and that was Death Valley Days. Now they had the problem of rebuilding the town, and they had to do it quickly.
So did they build it up fast enough to honor their commitment?
Fortunately, there were several buildings that were actually in the soundstage that were brought out and set up. One of them was a little house that was used as an ice cream stand. It was used, it had been used for any number of things out there. And they had another building that was brought in that became the hotel.
It's hard to imagine that there was a hotel where there's no hotel now. So tell us about that hotel. What was the importance of it?
It was built completely different than any other building I've ever seen done, because they built it from the top down. And what they did was they brought in this old army barracks, and they brought it in. It was a long building, had lots of rooms in the top, that could be used for things later, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And they propped this whole building up on stilts, and then they built the restaurant underneath of it. And then, of course, they put that building down on top of it. And while it wasn't used during the shows, when Richard Boone was there for Paladin, they named the new hotel the Paladin Hotel, and ironically misspelled the way they put Paladin on the sign, which was true. And it stayed there for years. It was there when I got there, which was really interesting, because one of the major films that happened after I got there was Gambler, The Adventure Continues. And that upstairs was used by Linda Evans when she came into town, and she stayed in the hotel. She was in the second room in from the far end, from the east end. But the thing that was really neat about the way that building was constructed was all of the rooms were on the front facing the town. And those rooms were accessed from the back on the south side from a hallway. And that hallway was used so that they could run cameras all the way up and down the length of that building. And on that side, on the south side of those rooms, some of those buildings looked like exteriors of cabins, or they looked like exteriors of little buildings, or they were entrances into something. So they got double duty out of every room that was on that floor, and they could film all of them from that floor by running the cameras up and down the hallway. It was really an interesting building. And there was a fellow who got shot off of that balcony, and they changed the balcony so it would break away, and he fell up off of that into the dirt down in Main Street.
Commercials. I know they shot a lot of commercials at Apacheland. Do you have any stories about those?
Oh my goodness gracious, we had all sorts of commercials that were done out there at that time. General Motors came out. They were doing their big deal out there for their new cars. And they had guys that would check the astrology to see what the moon was doing, what the sun was doing, what was the weather gonna do. And they dusted these cars, and where they had shadows, they'd take hairspray and they'd spray that so it didn't gleam off of the paint. And then they were all ready for this shoot. It took them like 3 days to set this thing up. And it was gorgeous, this beautiful red car. We can't do anything because it's sitting in the middle of town. We're not getting paid. And we can't even play with the car. And finally, come time to pull the trigger on that, it rained. I mean, that's a true story. It rained. It absolutely did rain. It was a mess. But then we could get back to doing what we were doing. And of course, we had a lot of fun. We were now the stars because we were doing the shows. We were doing the shoot 'em ups. And while we didn't have quite the crowds that they had back in the 60s and 70s, we still had some people out there who just loved to see people getting shot. They loved to see people falling off of anything. Could be a bucket, could be a stand, just so you fell off of something. And Charlie's shaking his head. He knows, he was there, did that. So, but be that as it may, all of those shows were live. They were absolutely live, and you never ever knew what was going to happen for sure, because everybody seemed to be pranksters. And there were some funny things. I had come out one time, and I wore a hat and a wig. And as this prospector, this sheriff was supposed to come after me, and he's trying to find my map. I found all this gold, and he wants my map. And he takes my hat, and he, looking into that, it's not in there, and he throws it, takes it, and shoots it. Well, my map wasn't in my hat, but my hair was. All of a sudden, the people in the audience were laughing. This isn't supposed to be funny. There's nothing funny about what we were doing. We're looking around. Of course, now I don't have my hair. I didn't think that was funny. But we looked up, and he had actually hit my hat with his black powder pistol, and the wad of paper had gone into the hat, and there was this little trickle of blue smoke coming up out of this hat. It's the greatest piece of comedy we ever did. Couldn't duplicate it, couldn't hit the hat, but that was a true story. Crazy things. There were times you never knew for sure that the old process, and it was always me, because I was the guy who was supposed to be in charge of teaching people shows and all that. So I was the straight guy. And I was pretty much the whipping boy every now and again. There was times, I came into town one time as a prospector, and I came in, I was celebrating because I found gold, and I wanted to go into the saloon, and the sheriff told me, you can't go in there. And I said, but I have to go in there. He said, you can't go in there. I said, but I gotta go in there, I'm thirsty. He says, you can't. I said, why? He said, because you're a minor.
You wore a lot of hats out there at Apacheland. You acted, you did stunts out there, which I know stuntmen get a lot of money for what they do. So you must have been paid a lot out there at Apacheland.
Never did. At Apacheland, we made $13 a day. Whether we got shot, whether we did anything, that was $13 a day is what we got paid out there in those days. I mean, we were setting the world on fire. But it was really kind of neat because my other job at the time was I was a marketing and documentation, documentary specialist for ITT Corporation. So I designed advertising and then went out there and got shot on the weekends.
Okay, Hank, just what was life like out at Apacheland, you know, back in the day?
They had a wonderful, wonderful menu that was served in the saloon, and they had a great big picture window that they'd cut into the wall. So as you sat in the main room behind the bar, you could look out that window and you looked directly at the Superstition Mountain. It was really a neat deal. And they still had the stage there where Linda Evans had danced during Gambler. Many of the musicians here. You go down, you see any number of the musicians in town today. At one time or another, they played at Apacheland back then, if they're old enough. But at any rate, now it gets us around to, we're past the commercials. We have, the town is picking up a little bit, but it's more of a touristy thing than a filming mecca. It's not doing that. We had Armand Asante come out, and Elizabeth Shue came out, and they did Blind Justice out there. Now that was interesting. Without getting into all the ramifications of what the movie was about, at the end of it, the script called for the church to be blown up. Well, they didn't blow our church up. They built one of their own, and it was a prop. It was just enough to hold it up and look like a church at a distance. And they had, and I don't even know if it's true that the guy's name was Fireball Bill, but they say the guy who did the wiring to blow this building up was Fireball Bill. And now you have to understand pyrotechnic, guys. If a little bit is good, a lot is better. They think that way. And what had happened was this church was wired in such a way that it was a two-part blast. It was to go ba-boom. The steeple was supposed to go straight up and explode, and then the bottom was to explode out from underneath of it. There were 9 cameras. 7 I've heard 9. I like 9, you know, more is better. We just talked about that. And so there were some buried in the ground, so they're facing the chapel. There were some on roofs, there were some over here, some over there, and they're all facing toward this thing. A lot of us were hired to go down there to be on the perimeter. And we were every bit of 1,000 yards away from that church. And no one was supposed to be inside that perimeter. That's why we were there, to keep people out. So that when this blast went off, there was nobody in there that was going to get hurt. Well, when the blast went off, it was like bearing in mind I'm 1,000 yards away, give or take a foot or two, when that went off, it concussed my head. It hit me so hard that it gave me a tremendous headache. It was like a big gun going off. It was like, it was terrible. And that building, actually, I think if we go down there today, there's still lumber falling out of the air from when that thing went off. And it went flat. I have pictures of that chapel, and it looks like firewood. There's nothing left. Several of the cameras were knocked off their stands. There was no glass left in the town. There were buildings that were actually moved, on their foundations. It's an old town, and some of these buildings were just cocked. People in Gold Canyon, there were a couple of them had picture windows blown out from the concussion. The phone calls going on, and people are used to hearing the guns going off down at the firing range, going away to Florence. They're used to hearing that. When this one went off, everybody was making phone calls.
Hey, Hank, did you have a favorite animal when you were making those Westerns?
The one that I liked working with the most was an old speckled jackass called Sweet Tooth. She was a burro who'd been out there, Lord knows, I mean, she knew the shows as well as we did. If there were two gunfires, she knew where she was, and the third gunfire, she knew it was done. And what she would do is she would walk off of Main Street. She wouldn't go until the show was done, but she would leave the main street, and she'd walk around to the end to where it said the billiard saloon, the east side of the saloon, and go in that door, and she'd walk up to the last stool, because Rene Boudreau, who was the caretaker at that time, would give her Cheetos after the show. Instead of her taking off and going to the barn where we'd have to chase her, that burro would come in to get her Cheetos. And you didn't want to be sitting on that stool, let me tell you, that was hers. She'd come in, get her Cheetos, and then one of the other guys or myself, we would take her back up to the barn and put her away. But that's what she'd do. She'd go in and get her Cheetos, and she'd stand there, never made a mess. Just smart old girl. She was cool.
So what was it exactly that ended Apacheland?
2004, Valentine's Day, the town burned down again. It just burned completely to the ground. And once again, what do we have left? We have the barn, and we have the chapel.
So Apacheland burns to the ground, but how did the chapel and the barn that survived make it all the way over here to the Superstition Mountain Museum?
Sue and Ed donated them to the museum. Larry Hedrick headed up the,
Who?
Larry Hedrick. He's kind of a tall, short, skinny, fat guy.
Oh, that guy, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He and Hank Brown were instrumental in getting all of that work done and brought up here. And of course, everybody can see it. You all can come up here and see the barn, and it's the real deal. It's the real deal. And the chapel, the Elvis Chapel that was shot at during the movie. And now we have the town, it's completely gone, which is why we're doing some of these films right now, so that we can talk about what was there. It is a part of our movie making, filmmaking history. It's very much a part of Arizona's history. And unfortunately, it's gone the way of so many of the studios have gone these days, because the Westerns just aren't what they were before. The studios just aren't what they were before. And unfortunately, so many of them have gone by the wayside. Maybe we can just keep this one alive a little bit longer. And you all can come up here and see part of it. And then there's that wonderful line that Charlie uses all the time.
Just another one of the mysteries of the Superstition Mountains?
That would be the one.
So there you have it. Apacheland burns to the ground, all except for the church and the barn, and it ends up From Apacheland all the way over to the Superstition Mountain Museum. Definitely a mystery of the Superstition Mountains.